In the far northwest corner of Australia, sealed inside sandstone shelters that almost no one will ever enter, there is a substance that should not exist. It is paint, and it has been alive for longer than the pyramids have stood. Scientists only confirmed it in 2011. Colonies of black fungi and crimson bacteria have colonized these images, feeding, reproducing, and quietly replacing themselves, generation after generation, for over 10,000 years. It's the only reason the colour hasn't faded under a tropical sun and a monsoon that returns without fail every single year. These paintings are not simply old. In a very real sense, they are still being painted by something that isn't human and has never stopped. That alone would be enough to call this place extraordinary. It isn't even the strangest part. For more than a century, archaeologists, anthropologists, and at least one Australian courtroom have fought over a single loaded question. Who made these figures? Because whoever they were, they didn't paint animals, the way almost every other culture on Earth did during the Ice Age. They painted people's slender, elegant figures dressed in tasselled skirts, sashes and elaborate headdresses, frozen mid-dance and mid-hunt, scattered across a wilderness the size of Slovakia. Online, and even on television, fringe theorists have pointed to those strange, elongated forms as proof of visitors from somewhere far beyond Earth. A far more dangerous theory, pushed for decades by a respected field researcher, claimed something almost as extraordinary, that the artists weren't Aboriginal at all. That claim didn't stay confined to a book. It was eventually carried into a courtroom as part of an attempt to strip Aboriginal Australians of their own land. This is the true story of the Gwion Gwion. If this is your first time on this channel, welcome. This is where geology, deep time, and ancient human memory collide the places where the official explanation sometimes turns out to be stranger and more important than the myth. We take these stories slowly because places like this deserve more than a quick scroll past. If that sounds like your kind of channel, subscribe now and turn on notifications, because we're about to walk through 12,000 years of art, law, and controversy that most of the world has never even heard of. To understand why this place has confounded so many capable people for so long, you first need to understand where it actually is. The Kimberley is one of the last true wildernesses left on Earth, a plateau of ancient sandstone in the far north of Western Australia, cut through by gorges, waterfalls, and tidal rivers unlike almost anywhere else on the planet. Along this coastline, the ocean can rise and fall by close to 12 metres in a single day, among the most extreme tides found anywhere on Earth. The region is larger than Germany and home to fewer than 40,000 people. Enormous sections of it have no roads at all. The only way in is by light aircraft, boat, or days of four-wheel drive travel on tracks that close completely, every single wet season. The climate itself swings between two extremes. For roughly 6 months of the year, the dry season leaves the land cracked and golden, waterholes shrinking to a fraction of their size. Then the monsoon arrives, and rivers that were barely a trickle become raging brown torrents within days. Waterfalls that had gone silent roar back to life, and entire roads vanish under floodwater. Major galleries places like Jar Island near King George Falls, and the shelters scattered through Swift Bay and the Mitchell Plateau can only be reached by boat or light aircraft, even in the best conditions, and not at all during the height of the wet. The stone itself began forming roughly 1.8 billion years ago, when rivers spread sand and silt across a shallow inland sea. Over hundreds of millions of years, that sediment was buried, compressed into sandstone up to 5 kilometres thick in places, then slowly uplifted and carved by monsoon rain and ancient rivers into the escarpment country we see today. Sheer orange cliffs, boulder fields, and shallow rock shelters in ranges Europeans once named the King Leopold Ranges, and which today, rightly, carry back their traditional name, the Wunambal Ranges. It's inside those shelters that the Gwion Gwion paintings are found not scattered at random, but concentrated across an almost unbelievable footprint, close to 100,000 individual sites, spread across roughly 50,000 square kilometres, an area larger than Costa Rica. And what's painted inside those shelters is unlike almost anything else on the planet. The figures are slender to the point of looking weightless, drawn with confident, continuous outlines, then filled with extraordinary detail conical and fan-shaped headdresses, tasselled sashes hanging from the waist and arms, dilly bags, boomerangs, spears, and multi-barbed hunting tools. Some figures appear caught mid-dance, others are frozen mid-stride, mid-throw, mid-fight. Researchers who spent decades cataloguing the art identified several recurring styles: tassel figures, sash figures, dynamic elegant action figures, and a more rigid clothes peg style, with some individual panels stretching almost 5 metres across a single rock face. They share many of these shelters with a second, more recent tradition, the wide-eyed, mouthless Wandjina spirit figures, still repainted today as part of living ceremony. And then there's the colour itself, a deep mulberry red that under a microscope isn't paint anymore, it's biology. Researchers examining the pigment discovered it had been almost entirely replaced by a living biofilm, black fungi and red cyanobacteria, locked in a symbiotic exchange of water and sugar, slowly etching themselves into the very quartz grains of the sandstone. Each generation dies, and the next grows directly over it, in the same shape, using the outline of the original artwork as its scaffold. That is the physical reality of this place, a vast, near inaccessible wilderness of ancient stone, holding tens of thousands of paintings that are, quite literally, still alive. The people who have lived alongside this art for longer than any nation on earth has existed never called it a mystery. They called it Guion Guion. The traditional owners of this country, principally the Ngarinyin, Worrorra and Wunambal Gaambera peoples, with the Balanggarra further to the east, never needed outside scientists to tell them the paintings were old or important or theirs. Long before the pastoralist Joseph Bradshaw ever set foot in the Kimberley, this art already had a name, a story, and a lore attached to it. According to Ngarinyin tradition, Gwion Gwion is the name of a small, long, beaked bird that pecked at insects hidden in the rock. In pecking, its beak began to bleed, and the blood ran down the stone in fine, trailing lines. From that blood, the first images formed. In this telling, the Gwion Gwion are not simply the paintings themselves, they are the name of the original ancestral beings. Children of the Great Mother, Jilinya, credited as the inventors of hunting technology, and the first artists ever to render the human form. Human painters, the story goes, later imitated the bird's technique, carrying the tradition forward across the land. For decades, outsiders treated this story as a charming footnote folklore worth recording once, then set aside while real archaeology took over. That began to change in 1992, when senior Ngarinyin lawmen revealed something the wider world had never properly been told. The paintings weren't only art, they were law. Specifically, they were bound up in what's known as Wunan, a system governing blood, land, and social obligation, passed down through generations as a kind of visual constitution. Written not on paper, but directly onto stone. Then, in 1998, at a rock art conference attended by researchers from across the world, Ngarinyin elder Paddy Worrorra went further still. He explained that Gwion Gwion was in fact the name of only one of 3 distinct groups of ancestral artists recognised in Ngarinyin knowledge alongside the Munga. Nyunga, associated with law and social structure, and the Janagi, messengers who carried sacred objects along the Kimberley's ancient trade routes. What outsiders had spent a century treating as a single anonymous mystery, the people who actually held the knowledge had understood, in careful and specific detail, all along. That same year also saw the start of a related formal effort. Elders including David Mwaljalai, Paddy Wama Ngudman, Lorian Gajno, and Paddy Neawara launched what they called the Pathway Project, a deliberate, elder-led effort to document this knowledge on their own terms, before it could be lost, misread, or claimed by outsiders all over again. Not far away, custodians connected to the Mwunjum community continued a related, unbroken tradition of their own, repainting the wide-eyed Wandjina rain spirits every December or January, a ceremony said to be essential for calling the monsoon back to the land each year. This knowledge carried real weight. Across the Kimberley, sacred sites are governed by strict protocol who may approach a given shelter, when and under whose authority. Certain places and certain stories remain restricted to initiated men or women. Elders describe real consequences for entering country or disturbing images without the standing to do so: sickness, misfortune, destructive storms. The neighbouring Wandjina figures, found layered over and alongside the Guion Guion in many shelters, are described as having no mouths for a specific reason. They are considered so powerful that if they spoke, the rain would never stop. None of this functioned as superstition designed to frighten outsiders away for its own sake. It was law, a working system for managing extraordinarily old, extraordinarily significant places, built by people who had lived alongside them for longer than written history has existed anywhere on Earth. And as the rest of this story shows, when the modern world finally began taking this country seriously on its own terms, it discovered that the old law had been careful for good reason. What follows isn't folklore. It's the documented, verifiable record 5 moments across 129 years when this place forced itself onto the attention of the outside world, whether the outside world was ready for it or not. Case file, 1891. Joseph Bradshaw wasn't looking for art. He and his brother were combing the remote country around the Prince Regent River for grazing land and had, by his own account, lost their bearings entirely. What he stumbled onto, on a sandstone wall above the Roe River, stopped him cold. Dozens of slender, finely painted human figures, more refined and more anatomically precise than anything he or any European had previously encountered in Australian rock art. The heat that day was reportedly severe, the brothers running low on water and their horses exhausted hardly the conditions one would expect for a discovery that would occupy scholars for more than a century afterward. He wrote up the encounter for the Royal Geographical Society the following year. For decades afterward, almost nobody followed up. Case file, 1938. Encouraged by Bradshaw's account, anthropologist A.P. Elkin led the first serious scientific expedition into the region specifically to study the art. That same year, a separate German-led team, the Frobenius Institute expedition, carried out its own extensive survey. It was this expedition that formally attached the name Bradshaw to the paintings in academic literature, a name that would stick for the next 70 years, even though the people who had actually lived among the paintings the entire time had never called them that at all. Case file, 1977 to 2007. In 1977, a self-taught Queensland researcher named Grahame Walsh began what became a 30-year, largely solitary campaign to document every Gwion Gwion site he could reach, often alone, often for weeks at a stretch, in genuinely punishing terrain, camping for months on end in some of the most remote, crocodile-inhabited country in Australia. By the time of his death in 2007, Walsh had personally photographed and catalogued roughly 1.5 million individual rock art images across some 1,500 previously unrecorded sites, the single largest archive of this art ever assembled. But Walsh's fieldwork came bundled with a theory, and that theory would do damage far beyond academia. Based on stylistic differences he perceived between the Gwion Gwion figures and later Aboriginal art, Walsh proposed that the paintings might not have been created by the ancestors of the Aboriginal people currently living in the region that they were instead the work of some other vanished mystery race. It might have stayed a fringe academic argument. It didn't. When a native title land claim reached the Australian court system, lawyers opposing the Aboriginal claimants sought Walsh out directly. He advised them that contemporary Aboriginal people bore no substantial genetic or cultural relationship to the artists, and therefore, by that reasoning, no legitimate claim to the land the art was found on. Case file, 2003. Closed decisively. The High Court of Australia ruled on the native title claim, formally recognising the Aboriginality of the Gwion Gwion artworks and rejecting the mystery race argument raised against the traditional owners. It wasn't a quiet academic resolution. It was the highest court in the country, weighing a fringe theory about ancient art against the testimony, law, an unbroken cultural connection of living people, and finding decisively in favour of the people who had never stopped calling this place home. Case file, 2020. The numbers finally arrive. A University of Melbourne team, led by geochronologist Damien Finch, achieved what over a century of speculation had failed to produce: a reliable physical date. By analysing carbon trapped inside fossilised mud wasp nests built directly on top of, and in one crucial specimen directly beneath, a Guion Guion painting, the team bracketed its age with genuine precision for the first time approximately 12,000 years old, give or take 500. Working alongside traditional owners on Balanggarra country, where the dated paintings were found. The study didn't just answer a scientific question. It closed the loop on the century-old mystery race claim for good, anchoring the art firmly within an unbroken timeline of Aboriginal occupation of the Kimberley stretching back over 40,000 years. Ian Weiner, a Balanggarra guide and traditional custodian who took part in the fieldwork, later said what mattered most to him was being able to hold both kinds of knowledge at once, the stories passed down through his own family, and the science now confirming them. 5 case files, 129 years, and at the centre of every one of them, the same question, asked by different people for very different reasons. Who were they? And why does the answer matter so much? If you're waiting for this to turn into a story about ancient astronauts, keep watching, because what researchers, and the people who actually hold this knowledge, uncovered is even stranger and far more human than anything a spaceship could explain. Subscribe now if you haven't already, because the next few minutes are going to change how you look at every unexplained ancient artwork you've ever seen. Rumours like this don't spread on their own. They need fuel, and the Guion Guion story had plenty of it. Some of that fuel came from respected sources acting irresponsibly. Grahame Walsh, for all his genuine, decades-long dedication to documenting the art, also entertained migration theories that stretched well past the evidence, at points drawing comparisons between elaborate Guion headdresses and unrelated rock art traditions on other continents, and floating ideas about prehistoric transoceanic voyages. Separately, other researchers produced age estimates using indirect methods, comparing depicted animals to the fossil record, or referencing the age of nearby boab trees that stretched as high as 46,000, even 70,000 years. Numbers that dramatic, attached to figures that strange, are exactly the kind of material that travels well on television. And travel it did. In recent years, the History Channel's long-running series Ancient Aliens turned its attention to Australia, presenting Aboriginal rock art from this same region as apparent evidence of prehistoric contact with extraterrestrial visitors. Much of the focus fell on the neighbouring Wandjina imagery, found in many of the same shelters round, haloed heads with enormous eyes and no mouth, repeatedly described in this kind of programming as looking uncannily like old-fashioned space helmets. The same broadcast period promoted an entirely unrelated claim too, that a set of carvings near Sydney, hundreds of kilometres away, were secretly ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs part of a broader pattern of crediting Australia's ancient past to almost anyone except the people who actually lived it. Australian archaeologists were, to put it mildly, unimpressed. Space archaeologist Dr. Alice Gorman of Flinders University described the broader pattern of crediting sophisticated Indigenous Australian art to outside visitors Egyptians, ancient astronauts, anyone except Aboriginal people as functioning less like genuine inquiry and more like a modern justification for taking Aboriginal land. It's a blunt assessment. Once you know how the mystery race theory was actually used, in an actual courtroom, it's also difficult to argue with. So scientists went back to basics. Rather than speculating about origins, they focused on evidence that could actually be measured. A comprehensive 2011 review of every available Kimberley rock art dating method concluded plainly that there was no substantial scientific evidence supporting the more extreme age claims then in circulation. The eye-catching 46 to 70,000 year range simply wasn't supported by rigorous testing. Archaeologist Professor Peter Veth, one of the leading authorities on Kimberley rock art, was equally direct about who made it. The work, he stated, is Aboriginal in origin, part of a long, continuous tradition of using art to mark significant places across the landscape, not the isolated output of some vanished outside culture. Every strand of physical evidence points the same direction. Genetic and archaeological research shows no sign of a population replacement or a vanished race anywhere in the Kimberley across more than 40,000 years of continuous occupation. Careful stylistic reanalysis has found Gwion Gwion figures sharing techniques and specific motifs with later indisputably Aboriginal art in the very same shelters, evidence of continuity, not rupture. And when the 2020 wasp nest dating study finally anchored the art at roughly 12,000 years old, it did so working directly alongside Balanggarra traditional owners, using their knowledge of the sites to guide the research itself. There was no lost civilization. There were no visitors from beyond the stars. There was, and is, one continuous living culture among the oldest continuous cultures on Earth, producing some of the most sophisticated art of the ancient world, on their own land, exactly where their descendants still stand today. Which raises an obvious question. If the who has been settled this clearly, why does this place still feel so genuinely unsettling? So if the mystery of authorship has been settled, and there are no aliens, and no vanished lost civilization, why does this place still deserve the word dangerous? Because it does. Just not in the way pseudo-archaeology wanted you to believe. Start with the country itself. The rivers and tidal gorges that wind through Gwion Gwion territory, the Prince Regent, the King George, the King Edward, are home to some of the highest densities of saltwater crocodiles found anywhere on the planet. Local guides don't treat this as folklore, they treat it as a daily operating procedure, warning visitors never to stand at a water's edge, never to assume a still, quiet pool is empty. Add daytime temperatures that regularly climb past 40 degrees Celsius, a wet season capable of cutting off entire regions for months at a time, and hundreds of kilometres between many galleries and the nearest hospital, and you have a landscape where one wrong step or fall on loose rock, a snake bite. A boat that's late coming back can turn fatal astonishingly fast. This isn't a story about a cursed location. It's a story about one of the least forgiving landscapes left on Earth, which is exactly why large sections of it now require a traditional owner-issued visitor permit before you're allowed anywhere near a gallery. On Wunambal Gaambera country, for example, visiting many of the most significant galleries requires a Ungu visitor pass, issued directly by the traditional owners. It exists partly to manage the very real physical risk to travellers moving through crocodile country in extreme heat, and partly to protect fragile sites from threats that have nothing to do with any ancient curse, uncontrolled bushfire, mineral exploration pressure, and a rapidly shifting climate, all of which pose a far more immediate risk to this 12,000-year-old art than any pseudo-documentary ever proposed. Then there's a second danger, quieter and stranger, hiding inside the very thing that makes this place remarkable. Remember the living paint. The black fungi and red bacteria that have kept these images vivid for thousands of years exist in a delicate equilibrium of biofilm adapted, generation after generation, to one exact microclimate on one exact rock face. It doesn't take an earthquake to destroy that. It can take a single human hand. The oils and microorganisms on human skin, a shift in humidity from too many visitors breathing inside an enclosed shelter, even a torch held too close for too long, can be enough to disrupt a living system that has survived monsoons and droughts for 12,000 years, but never evolved any defense against a curious tourist. In a very real sense, some of the oldest surviving art on the planet could be damaged beyond repair by something as small and as human as a fingertip. Which brings the story back, finally, to the old law. For thousands of years, access to these shelters was never casual. It was governed by initiation, by kinship, by the specific permission of the people who held the knowledge to approach safely. Outsiders often read those restrictions as superstition, or mystery for its own sake. Standing here, with the science laid bare, it looks like something closer to the opposite, a functioning, inherited system of risk management, built by people who understood long before anyone had the word biofilm, and long before anyone needed a lesson from a crocodile to learn caution that some places demand to be approached carefully, or not at all. The ancients were never wrong about the danger here. They simply understood, correctly, exactly what kind of danger it was. In the end, the Gwion Gwion never needed aliens, or a lost race, or a vanished civilization to explain them. They needed patience, the kind it takes to spend 30 years alone in the bush, cataloguing a million images. Or 12,000 years quietly repainting yourself, one microscopic generation at a time. Or several generations of traditional owners insisting, against real and sustained pressure, that their own knowledge of their own country deserved to be believed. Science and ancient law arrived at the same conclusion from two completely different directions, decades apart. When they finally met first in a courtroom, then in a laboratory, they agreed that, more than any spaceship or lost empire, might be the strangest and most genuinely mysterious part of this entire story. How rarely the truth needs embellishing once someone finally takes the time to look at it properly and listen to the people who knew it all along. What do you think should places like this stay restricted, even from well-meaning visitors? Tell us in the comments below. And if this is the kind of history you want more of, subscribe and we'll see you in the next one.